Joining me today is American linguist, thinker, author of over 100 books, cognitive scientist Noam Chomsky. Thank you very much for joining us on RT. I'd like to begin with Iran. The new president, Rouhani, has appeared to be much softer than his predecessor. On his recent trip to the US, it was hailed progress, first time two presidents spoke in over 30 years. Do you see US policy towards Iran changing?
The real issue is what will happen in the United States. The way the issue is presented in the United States and most of the West, the problem is Iran's intransigence and its rejection of the demands of the international community. There's plenty to criticize in Iran, but the real issue is quite different. It's the refusal of the West, primarily the United States, to enter into serious diplomacy with Iran. And as far as Iran violating the will of the international community, that depends on a very special definition of international community, which is standard in the West, where the term means the United States and anybody who goes along with it. So if the international community includes the world, then the story is quite different. So, for example, the non-aligned countries, which is most of the world's population, have vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium, still do. The nearby region, the Arab world, Arabs don't like Iran. That's quite unpopular. That's hostilities that go back very far. But they do not regard Iran as a threat. A very small percentage regard Iran as a threat. They regard the threats they perceive are the United States and Israel. So they're not part of the world as far as international community is concerned. But it's a Western obsession. And are there ways to deal with it, whatever one takes the threat to be? Sure, there are ways. So, for example, in 2010, there was a very positive advance that could have mitigated whatever the threat is supposed to be. Turkey and Brazil reached a deal with Iran in which Iran would ship out its low-enriched uranium for storage in Turkey, and in return, the West would provide isotopes for Iran's medical reactors. As soon as that was announced, Brazil and Turkey were bitterly condemned by Washington and by the media, which more or less reflexively follow what Washington says. The Brazilian government was pretty upset by this, so much so that the Brazilian foreign minister, Amorim, released a letter from President Obama to the president of Brazil in which Obama had proposed this, assuming that Iran would turn it down. When Iran accepted, of course, you had to denounce it. And Obama went right to the Security Council to try to get harsher sanctions. Well, that's one case. There's a more recent one, which is even more interesting. Last December, there was supposed to be an international conference in Finland to carry forward long-standing efforts to establish a zone free of nuclear weapons, all weapons of mass destruction, in fact, in the Middle East. This is under the auspices of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, basically the UN. Well, it was to be in December. It didn't happen. First thing that happened is Israel announced they wouldn't participate. Then everyone was waiting to see, everyone was interested, was waiting to see what Iran would say. Iran said they would participate with no conditions. Immediately, Obama called off the conference, giving the reasons which are the official Israeli reasons. Can't have a conference until there's a regional peace settlement. Of course, in the background, there can't be a regional peace settlement until the U.S. and Israel stop blocking the international consensus on an Israel-Palestine agreement, as they're doing and have been for 35 years. So no meeting. The Arab countries, who have pressed for this for a long time, said they're going to go ahead anyway, but of course you can't without U.S. support. The European Parliament passed a resolution calling for quick renewal of the initiative. Russia supported it. People in the United States have done almost nothing about it for a very simple reason. Not a word about this has appeared in the American press, literally. You can read about it in arms control journals or international affairs journals or in articles that I write, things on the fringe. But the press is silent about it, so no pressure. Well, could that have succeeded? Maybe. Could have been steps towards mitigating the crisis. And this goes, I won't go through the record, but this goes pretty far back. As long as the West, following the U.S. lead, refuses to accept a negotiated diplomatic solution, the situation could be very serious. And it's also worth remembering that every day the United States and Israel are violating international law on this issue. The UN Charter, which anybody cares, bans the threat or use of force in international affairs. Every time an official says all options are open, that's a criminal act. Here, nobody cares. We're supposed to be able to carry out criminal acts. Actually, there was a dramatic illustration of that yesterday. If you read yesterday's New York Times, big front page article on the capture of al-Libi, the jihadi target in Libya. Read down to the bottom of the article. There's a quote from the Secretary of State who's asked whether, in a press conference, was this legal? And he said, yes, it's legal, it's in accord with American law. That means American law says we can go into any country we like and kidnap somebody we want, and that's legal. Of course, is that anybody else's law? Suppose Al-Qaeda or some other country, say Yemen, whoever, comes to the United States and kidnaps John Kerry. Is that legal, if it's legal by their laws? What this says is we claim that we own the world. What we decide applies universally. Doesn't matter what international law is. No one else has these rights. An honest report would have had this as the headline and would have explained what it means. But nobody's going to comment on that in the United States or England or probably most of the world, most of the West at least, elsewhere they met. But these are very important facts. The United States has always adopted the principle of American exceptionalism. This goes back to the early colonists. But it's not a unique American position. Every great power, at least everyone I know of, has taken the same position. So France was unique in its civilizing mission, which was announced proudly as the Minister of War was calling for the extermination of the people of Algeria. Russia under Stalin was uniquely exceptional and magnificent while it was carrying out all kinds of crimes. Hitler was pronounced German, not German exceptionalism when he took over Czechoslovakia. It was done to end ethnic cleansing, to bring the people under the broader power of the German high culture and technology. In fact, I can't think of an exception. Every great power that I know of has claimed to be exceptional. The United States among them. Exceptional in its right to use force and violence.
Doesn't the U.S., I should say, take it a step further with exceptionalism?
Only because the U.S. is more powerful. If you go back 100 years, British and French exceptionalism were far more powerful than that of the U.S. had the same doctrine. But what really mattered for the world was the major imperial powers. And in Russia's domains, it was Russia that was exceptional. Try to find an exception. So the exceptionalism is kind of interesting in that it seems to be without exception. Everybody accepts it. And of course, it's ludicrous in each case.
I'd like to ask you about Syria. They've just begun to dismantle their chemical arsenal. The U.S. now seemingly agrees more with Russia that perhaps military intervention is not the best way, although it seems to be dragging its feet on Syria policy. Do you expect provocations from the armed rebels in terms of trying to hamper this step to disarm?
The armed there are many armed rebel groups, and they're kind of unpredictable. A lot of them are fighting each other. A lot of them are local. Some of them are actually pushing for autonomy. Like in the Kurdish area, the armed rebel groups are really pressing for Kurdish autonomy, may link up to Iraqi Kurdistan. And there's all sorts of others. Yeah, and there are also secular democratic elements, which, I mean, personally, they're the kind of people I'd like to see take over. But, you know, the dynamics of armed conflict are that the harshest and most brutal elements on all sides tend to come to the fore. That's almost inevitable. So, you know, one may like them, as I do, but I don't think their prospects are very good. I don't think what they will do is predictable. Actually, it's fine to get rid of Syrian chemical weapons. It's great, but it's not what the policy ought to be. When President Obama and the press and so on talk about the Chemical Weapons Convention, they crucially misstate it purposely. Chemical weapons, what's stated is that the Chemical Weapons Convention bans the use of chemical weapons. It's only part of the story. The convention bans the production, storage, or use of chemical weapons. Now, production and storage can't be mentioned, because if you mention them, you've got to dismantle Israel's chemical weapons. So therefore, that can't be mentioned. But this is a perfect opportunity to move to eliminate chemical weapons from the region. Not it's good to remove them from Syria, but remove them from the region. And Syrian chemical weapons are not there just for fun. They were there as a counter to Israeli nuclear weapons. Israel's the only country with massive nuclear capacity in the region. So there's a broader issue. It goes back to the question of weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, which the U.S. has been blocking for the same reason. So this is a partial, it's good in itself, but very partial, and the broader opportunities are not being pursued and are not even being discussed outside of, you know, really marginal areas.
Recent information released by whistleblower Edward Snowden stirred up a whole lot of scandal across the globe. Some see him as a villain, others as a hero. The U.S. Wants to try him, while other people are calling for him to receive the highest human rights prizes. What do you think of him?
I think he performed the responsibility of an honest citizen. Let the population know what your elected representatives are doing. The same thing with Bradley Chelsea Manning. Let people know what your government is doing. Now the claim is that those who want him hanged, or, you know, traitor, etc., what they say is it harms security. There's two problems with that defense. One is that when a government or it's others related to it claims security, it literally carries no information. The reason is it's predictable. No matter what any state does, no matter how awful, it's going to say necessary for security. A message that's completely predictable is completely uninformative. So first, it's uninformative. We can, however, look and see what the claim of security amounts to. And here, it's pretty easy in a society like the United States, precisely because it is a very free and open society, maybe the most in the world. So we have a huge record of declassified documents going way back that were classified for security reasons, but are now available, huge array of them, you can study them, and ask to what extent was security relevant. And I've done a lot of work on this, and others can do it too, and there's a conclusion. Security is almost always relevant, but it's security of the government from its own population. That's the security concern. A genuine security, like security of the population from attack, is a very low concern. And you can see this in state policy as well. There's no time to go through it, but if you run through the record of state policy from the very beginning up till the present, security is just of the population is not a high priority. And the United States is not alone in this. That's pretty common.
Why do we not see more Americans scrutinize NSA spying, Obama's drone campaigns, clear violations and things that you have certainly people abroad criticizing the U.S. for? Why is it so quiet back home?
Because the security, it's a frightened population, and the security argument has weight. People feel that somehow the government's protecting us. I mean, take, say, drones. The drone campaign is by far the biggest terrorist campaign in the world. It's not never described that way, but it's of course what it is. Furthermore, it's a terrorist-generating campaign. From the highest levels and most respected sources, it's recognized that the drone attacks create potential terrorists in quite a substantial scale. So therefore, it is a threat to U.S. security, quite apart from being a terrorist campaign in itself. Almost never discussed. Take the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was undertaken with warnings from the intelligence services in the United States and Britain, both the attacking countries. Intelligence services warned that this is going to increase terrorism. It did, by a huge factor. According to government statistics, by about a factor of 7 the first year. Does that help security? Well, that other reasons to invade Iraq, not security. And this goes way back. Let's go back to 1950, okay? The U.S. was overwhelmingly powerful, had about half the world's wealth, incomparable security, and so on. There was a potential danger, serious danger. ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. They didn't exist, but they were going to exist. Well, if the government had any interest in security, it would have moved to see if Russia would accept a treaty to ban the production of these weapons. And it's very possible that they would have, not because they're nice people, but because they knew they were way behind. So it might have worked. There's a kind of a standard history of nuclear weapons policy by McGeorge Bundy. He was National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson. He had access to the highest level internal documents. And in this book, there's a couple of lines, which are the most important in the book, hidden inside it, which observe that he could not find any paper, internal paper, that even raised this possibility. The concern over destruction of the country was so limited that they never even discussed the possibility of developing a treaty arrangement with their own only adversary, which could have eliminated this threat. It's just not a concern. And that's the way states operate. Where we know anything about state policy, it's very typically like this. These are power systems. They have their own interests and concerns. Security of the population is not a high concern. But the population accepts it. They're afraid. And they've accepted in other countries too. They're afraid. They need Big Brother to protect us from enemy. So there's very little protest. And of course very little discussion. So check to see where you can find the drone campaign described as a terrorist campaign, which is generating terrorists. You can find it on the fringes, but for most people, we've never heard anything like that.
Thank you very much for your time, for inviting us to your office here at MIT. That was Noam Chomsky, and I'm Anissa Naoué for RT.